A soft green light once promised glamour, health, and the future, and it quietly took the lives of the women who painted it. Hello! Stay with me, because this is a story about light and labor, about courage in the face of powerful companies, and about how a handful of workers forced the world to rethink safety at work. If you find stories like this important, please subscribe for more. Picture the early 1900s. Science had just revealed a new, strange energy, radium. It glowed in the dark. It sparked imaginations. Doctors, advertisers, and inventors called it a miracle. People put it in cosmetics, fountain pens, even health tonics. But the biggest commercial boom came from the glow on watches and instrument dials. In a world going to war and running machines at night, luminous dials were suddenly indispensable. In dim factories, thousands of small faces crowded around workbenches. Most were young women. They were known as dial painters. Their job looked simple: paint tiny numbers in hands with a luminous paint so soldiers, sailors, mechanics, and everyday people could read their watches in the dark. The paint was thin, the brushes were fine, and the work demanded a steady hand. It paid by the piece. For many, it was solid work during tough times. The glow made the task almost magical. Under gas lamps, the numerals seemed to float like moonlight. The women took pride in their speed and skill. They signed their work with tiny, perfect strokes. Their fingers and lips grew stained with a faint green dust that everyone joked about. It became part of the job's identity. But the dust was more than color. It contained radium, a radioactive element that did not belong inside the human body. To keep brush points sharp, the women were taught to shape them with their mouths. They learned to point the brush with a quick, practiced motion. Each tiny lick brought minuscule amounts of paint into the mouth. Day after day, month after month, those tiny amounts added up. They did not glow inside, they stayed invisible. And for a long time, no one knew this glow could kill. At first, there were small signs. A tooth here. A sore there. Women complained of tiredness and strange pains. Some developed persistent infections in the jaw. Doctors often misread these as ordinary dental problems. The companies that made the paint insisted the work was safe. Supervisors told women the material was harmless. Management protected profits and reputation. The women were left to get sicker. The pattern grew clear. Pain turned into chronic illness. Bright smiles faded. Some workers lost teeth and began to have trouble eating. Others developed bone problems and severe fatigue. The term radium jaw entered conversations, a painful condition that attacked bone tissue. Words like anemia and bone disease were used by physicians. Families watched their mothers, sisters, and wives change slowly. The factory's glow had a cost that showed up on faces and in tent rays. When the women sought help, the truth was hard to get. Employers denied responsibility. Medical experts disagreed. Tests existed, but testing for radiation inside the body was new and uneven. Newspapers began to pick up small stories. The public reaction shifted from fascination with radium's sparkle to a darker curiosity. People asked, what happens when industry swallows science without safety checks? Who would speak for the workers? One of the first to stand up was Grace Fryer, a former dial painter. She and a handful of other women decided they would not let their suffering be buried. They filed suit against the company that had hired them. Their legal struggle started quietly in the courts but soon swelled into a public battle. The women sat for medical exams, shared painful stories, and faced courtroom confrontation with corporations and their lawyers. Their courage turned private tragedy into public truth. The case was not quick. It was messy, expensive, and emotionally draining. The company delayed, disputed, and defended its practices. The women faced social pressure and sometimes scorn. Yet their persistence shone. Scientists began to test bones, measure radioactivity, and build a clear scientific link between the luminous paint and the injuries. Slowly, the evidence grew overwhelming. The courts could no longer ignore the connection between the work and the sickness. When the settlement came, it was not a tidy victory. Money could not bring back lost health. Many of the women suffered for the rest of their lives, and some died young. But the case accomplished something greater than individual compensation. It forced headlines and investigations. It changed the conversation about employer responsibility. It showed that invisible hazards, dust, fumes, radiation, could be deadly, and that workers deserved protection even when dangers were not obvious. The ripple effects were profound. Regulators and scientists began to develop standards for safe handling of radioactive materials. Medical professionals took occupational illness more seriously. The story of the dial painters entered law school casebooks and public policy debates. It helped shape the idea that workers needed rights, protections, and the means to challenge unsafe practices. This is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a lesson in how change happens. Tenacity mattered. So did science, slowly catching up to reality. So did the press and public outrage. The women's case became a turning point, not the sole cause of reform, but a powerful spark. Over the following decades, industries adopted better controls, monitoring equipment improved, and government agencies strengthened rules for hazardous materials. New professions grew up to study occupational health. The glow that had once been a fashion statement became a warning sign for regulators. We should also remember the social context. At the time, many workers had few options. Wage work was limited, and women often accepted risks that male-dominated industries escaped. The dial painters were ordinary women who had become experts at their craft. They painted tiny, perfect numerals that later shone on the wrists of soldiers, doctors, and civilians. Their skill was invisible until the consequences demanded attention. How should we remember them? With dignity and respect. It is easy to sensationalize illness. But these were human lives, people with families, friendships, and hopes. They loved their work and were proud of their skill. They also paid dearly for their labor. Honoring them means telling the truth. It means learning how regulations, science, and collective action can protect future generations. The legacy reaches into our lives today. Modern safety rules, awareness of chemical and radiation hazards, routine workplace monitoring, and the idea that workers can sue for occupational harm all grew, in part, from cases like this. We live in a world where laboratories label materials with hazard signs, where protective equipment is expected, and where employee health is considered a priority in many industries. None of that would be exactly the same without the lessons learned in the radium era. There are wider lessons too. Technology will always outpace our understanding sometimes. New substances and new methods can promise benefits and hide risks. The story of the Radium Girls warns us to be cautious, to demand transparency, and to require independent science and regulation when new technologies become popular. It also reminds us that ordinary people, workers, neighbors, and families often lead the way in recognizing danger. In the end, the glow should be remembered for both meanings, the literal light on the dials, and the light of public conscience that the women ignited. Their fight forced companies, doctors, and governments to see what had been unseen. It made workplaces safer for millions who followed. We've told the arc, the radium craze, the skilled factory work, the hidden harm, the legal struggle, and the lasting reforms. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing so more histories like this reach others. History teaches us by example. When ordinary people insist on dignity and safety, systems can change. The green glow dimmed on those watch faces, but the light the women cast forward still guides how we think about work, risk, and responsibility. Thank you for watching. Hook, the glow that seemed magical. A soft green light came from the faces of watches, clocks, and military instruments, and people called it miraculous. Hello. Many called radium a wonder, and its faint, lasting glow seemed like proof that science could bend nature. At first, the glow was celebrated. It made numbers readable in the dark. It made soldiers' instruments visible at night without a flame. It turned ordinary objects into small wonders. Advertisements promised health, ease, and modern life. Sporting goods, cosmetics, and bottles of so-called radiant water appeared on store shelves, and the element's magic crossed from laboratories into everyday homes. Scientists understood radium as a powerful source of radiation, but the public saw only a beautiful light, a promise of progress. Inside the factories where that glow was born, the work was painstaking and quiet. Women sat at long tables under bright electric lamps. Their job was to paint tiny numbers in hands with a special luminous paint. Each stroke had to be perfect. Each tiny dial had to glow evenly. To get the fine tip on their brushes, they were taught, or told, to shape it with their lips. This practice, known as lip pointing, seemed harmless at the time. The paint felt fine, almost like chalk. It smelled faint and went on smoothly. Workers were paid by piece, so speed mattered. Faster hands meant more money. The faster they worked, the more they leaned on that soft green light as the sign of a good day's labor. Supervisors and company literature reinforced the wonder. Managers praised the beauty of the finished dials and the women's skill. Company brochures and some popular journals linked radium to health and vitality. The paint was sold as modern and safe. That message came from inside laboratories and from sales floors. It reached the workers who mixed pigments, filled brushes, and painted the tiny numerals over and over, until their fingers and mouths knew the paint as closely as any tool. At first, the glow seemed purely magical to the workers themselves. They practiced tracing the numerals with perfect steadiness. They painted up to hundreds of dials a day. The glow was proof of craft. They would strike a match or turn out a light to watch their work come alive with a green sheen, and the feeling was almost joyful. In company photos, they are shown smiling, holding up radiantly painted watches. For many, that luminous finish was a source of pride and identity. It also hid the danger. The same glow that made tiny timepieces readable in the dark masked a silent harm building inside the body. Symptoms developed slowly. Pain came first for many. Joints ached and bones felt weak. Teeth loosened. Simple bruises did not heal as they should. Fatigue became common. Some workers developed severe infections in the jaw that doctors later linked to radiation damage. The illnesses were treated with disbelief at first. Employers offered reassurances rather than answers. Medical understanding lagged behind the new risk, and companies often downplayed the connection between work and suffering. Families watched women fade in strength, and communities sought explanations that fit the glowing miracle they had once celebrated. A small group of these women refused to accept that silence and hiding were the only responses. They asked for medical examinations. They pressed for answers. Some recruited lawyers and took their stories public. In press rooms and courtrooms, they told how they had painted dials, how they had pointed their brushes with their lips, how they had warned supervisors and been told the work was safe. One of the most visible voices among them spoke bravely about symptoms and loss, and became the face of a wider struggle. Their determination turned a private suffering into a public issue. Photographs of wrists and hands, of dental tenth rays and bone studies, began to show a pattern that could not be ignored. Scientists and physicians brought new methods to bear. They measured radium in bones and in living tissues, and those tests showed what the eye could not. The evidence connected the luminous paint directly to the harm. The companies responded with denials and legal defenses, as would be expected in any battle over responsibility and money. But the women's cases pushed courts and regulators to listen in a new way. Their testimony, combined with scientific findings, helped shape the idea that employers must protect workers from invisible hazards, not just visible ones. The legal fight changed how people thought about work safety. It forced industrial leaders, lawmakers, and scientists to confront the idea that innovations could bring hidden costs. The cases led to better recognition of occupational disease in courts and among insurance programs. They helped inspire tighter rules for handling radioactive substances and for labeling materials that could harm health. At workplaces across many industries, managers began to look more closely at ventilation, protective gear, and training. Slowly, industrial hygiene moved from a set of best guesses to a field with actual standards and practice. The glow that once seemed purely magical became a warning sign that new technologies require careful study and respect. Beyond the courts, the story reshaped public trust. Consumers learned to ask harder questions about so-called miracle products. Journalists covered the workers' suffering and the science behind it, and their reporting nudged regulators into action. Health agencies and occupational safety advocates began to create guidelines to limit exposure and to monitor workers' health. Those changes did not undo the harm that had already occurred. They did, however, create protections that helped prevent similar tragedies, and they set a precedent that workers' voices and scientific evidence could combine to change policy. The women who fought were ordinary in many ways, yet extraordinary in their persistence. Their struggle added human urgency to technical debates. It cost them dearly in health and in time, but their courage forced industries and the public to rethink what progress should cost. The glow that once seemed purely beautiful became a cautionary tale about the gap between appearance and safety. In time, workplaces came to accept that the invisible must be measured, regulated, and controlled. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more historical narratives that connect science, industry, and human lives. Thank you for listening. The light that first seemed like a small miracle taught a larger lesson, that wonder without understanding can bring harm, and that ordinary people can change systems when they insist on truth and safety. Background: the radium craze and early 20th century optimism. A faint, blue-green light captured the public imagination and promised a brighter future for industry, health, and everyday life. Hello! In an age full of confidence in science and progress, radium arrived like a miracle, glowing, rare, and mysterious, and people believed it could help solve many human problems. Scientists who isolated radium described a new kind of energy, and that discovery fed a powerful optimism. Newspapers and magazines celebrated breakthroughs and framed them as evidence that modern science could lift humanity out of older ills. Industry moved quickly to turn novelty into products. Wealthy inventors, advertisers, and medical entrepreneurs embraced the idea that small amounts of radioactivity might stimulate health or improve performance. A wide array of products followed: luminous watch dials that shone in the dark, health tonics and creams that promised rejuvenation, and devices that claimed to cure aches and build vitality. The glow was sold as both fashionable and beneficial. Cities and factories were changing fast. Mass production and the new chemistry of the time encouraged rapid adoption of materials that promised efficiency and spectacle. Companies competed to place glowing logos and luminous hands on watches, instruments for the military. These glowing dials needed a special paint that contained radium mixed with a phosphor. Applying those tiny, precise numerals required skilled hands. Employers looked for workers who could do detailed, repetitive work with fine brushes. The pool of labor chosen for that task was largely young women, steady, careful, and detailed in their craft. Workshops where dial painting took place looked ordinary at first glance. Long benches, small glass vials of luminous paint, and rows of elegant watch faces waiting to be finished. The paint itself was prized because it glowed without any external light source. Managers and supervisors taught a method called pointing so that tiny brushes made a fine tip. Workers were told to shape the brushes with their lips. It was quick, precise, and became an expected habit. No one in management warned them about the danger of ingesting or inhaling the substance. And why would they? Radium was popularized as novel and safe by many voices, including some in the scientific and medical communities. Advertising stoked the radium craze in ways that mixed admiration for technological achievement with outright health claims. Ads told consumers that radiation could invigorate the body. Spas and clinics offered radium treatments. Elegant illustrations showed confident modern women and men bathed in a scientific glow. The social mood leaned heavily toward trust in experts and products carrying the stamp of modern chemistry. That trust made it easy for corporations to expand production of radium-containing goods without strict oversight or skepticism. Regulation lagged behind enthusiasm. Governments and health authorities had not yet developed the rules and measuring tools to control exposure. People assumed that because the glow came from science, it was inherently safe. Within that atmosphere of possibility and confidence, factory management focused on productivity and quality. Employers praised speed and neatness. They advertised steady pay and opportunities to learn a craft. For many young women, the jobs offered independence and a wage earned in a respectable environment. They were recruited from small towns and factory districts, promised stable hours and good work. The reality was more complicated. Brushes were delicate, demands for precision were high, and the workday was long. Safety training was almost non-existent when it came to handling the luminous paint.
Instead, employers often encouraged practices that made the work easier at the cost of safety, like shaping brush tips with the mouth.
The glow that sold products was also left unexamined as a workplace hazard.
Reports of illness began to surface among those workers.
It started with fatigue and persistent pain that doctors struggled to diagnose.
Bones weakened, dental problems appeared, and some workers developed infections that resisted simple treatment.
The pattern of illness affecting the bones and mouth after repeated exposure to the luminous paint eventually drew attention.
Yet early responses from factory owners and some medical practitioners were dismissive. Companies insisted their factories were safe.
In public statements, they attributed sickness to unrelated causes or general frailty. The cultural halo around radium made it difficult for victims to be believed. Workers who raised concerns met denial and, at times, pressure to stay quiet.
When the women who worked with radium organized and demanded answers, they faced powerful opposition.
Legal systems of the time were not tuned to the idea of occupational disease caused by an invisible element. Courts and corporations argued that injuries must come from other causes or that employees had assumed the risk. The fight required courage. A few determined workers sought counsel from sympathetic doctors and lawyers. They refused to let their stories be buried. News coverage slowly shifted public perception as journalists began to document the human cost behind the glowing products. Photographs, testimony, and careful reporting helped translate individual suffering into a broader public concern about industrial safety and corporate responsibility. The legal struggle did not end with a simple victory.
It unfolded in courtrooms and in the court of public opinion. Lawsuits exposed internal company records and highlighted what management knew about the dangers of radium and when they knew it.
As these details became public, the narrative of radium as harmless glamour cracked. Regulators, pressured by public outrage and evidence, began to rethink standards for industrial chemicals and worker protection. What had once been promoted as a personal tonic and fashionable glow became recognized as a hazardous substance requiring control. The cases brought by the workers forced a reckoning about employer responsibilities and the rights of employees to a safe workplace.
Long-term changes followed the struggle.
Public health authorities developed methods to measure radioactivity and to set exposure limits. Industries that used radioactive materials adopted safer handling procedures and improved training. The idea that invisible risks required regulation gained traction. Occupational medicine grew as a field. Doctors started to link patterns of illness to specific industrial exposures. Laws eventually evolved to recognize occupational disease and to allow workers to seek compensation.
Corporate accountability shifted as well.
The willingness of courts to hear these claims and recognize the suffering of workers became a model for future labor rights cases. The legacy of that era is complex. On one level, it tells a story about the dangers of unbridled faith in new technologies without adequate safeguards. On another level, it shows how everyday people, many of them young women, forced institutions to change. Their persistence reshaped how industry, science, and government approached worker safety. The luminous dials and glossy advertisements that once symbolized modern life are now also a reminder of what can be lost when profit and novelty outpace care and regulation. Still, the human cost remains at the center. Workers who once painted those tiny numerals paid a high price.
Families suffered. Communities mourned.
Their experience helped create systems that protect countless workers today from unseen hazards. Safer workplaces, mandatory safety equipment, exposure monitoring, and the legal right to compensation are part of that inheritance. When modern regulations prevent similar tragedies, they do so because a tragic chapter was opened and then closed through bravery and public pressure. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe for more. The tale of radium's glow is both a cautionary tale and a testament to the persistence of ordinary people who demanded justice. It shows how hope and science can be powerful and how vigilance, law, and collective action are necessary companions to technological progress. The job, dial painting, lip pointing, and workplace conditions. In the early 20th century, a new, glowing material promised to make the dark visible.
Hello, and thank you for listening.
If you find this story meaningful, please subscribe for more histories told clearly and respectfully. Factories that painted watch dials and instrument faces hired young women to apply a special luminous paint by hand. The paint was a mix of powdered radium and a luminous compound such as zinc sulfide. It looked harmless on the palette, and supervisors called it modern, clean, and almost magical. Workers learned to mix tiny amounts into a paste and then lay that paste onto the numbers and hands of watches, clocks, compasses, and military instruments. They worked with fine brushes, steady hands, and great speed. Work began with a flat metal dial held in a jig. A dial painter held a tiny camel hair brush and, stroke by careful stroke, filled the numerals and hands with the luminous compound. Steady work produced hundreds of painted dials in a single day. Supervisors timed the girls and praised neat work. Many of the women were young, many were recent migrants or from modest means, and the work paid a steady wage in an era with few alternatives for women. It was detailed, patient work that demanded concentration and a remarkably fine tip on each brush. To keep that tip sharp, painters were taught a technique called lip pointing. Lip pointing meant putting the brush in the mouth and shaping the hairs into a fine point with the lips and tongue. It was faster than using a file, and employers encouraged it because it saved time and produced precision. Women described shaping the brush between their teeth and lips dozens of times an hour. It felt normal at first. Many thought the paint tasted faintly metallic or chalky. Supervisors sometimes joked about the glow and told workers not to worry. Management reassured everyone that radium was safe and touted its modernity. The workroom itself was crowded, brightly lit with electric lamps, and often heated during cold months. Yet airflow was poor. Painters sat at long benches shoulder to shoulder under the glare of lamps meant to help them see the tiny numbers. Dust from the paint settled on benches, tools, and clothing. Brushes and palettes lay exposed. Workers had little protective equipment. No gloves. No respirators. No fume hoods. Smoking was common in some rooms. Break areas and lavatories were basic. Rooms were separated by partitions, but contaminants traveled easily on hands and clothing. Supervisors prioritized output and efficiency. Safety measures were minimal or absent. Many of these workplaces were part of a larger craze around radium. Advertisers and scientists had promoted radium as a wonder element useful for health products, luminous cosmetics, and household items. The bright glow on a watch dial suggested progress in modern life. Companies that made dial paint marketed their product as an advanced chemical, and watch manufacturers advertised luminous faces as a selling point. That atmosphere of enthusiasm helped normalize the work. It made danger less obvious, because radium was associated with science and improvement. Practical work conditions reinforced a culture of routine. Painters were supplied with small saucers of paint. Brushes were rinsed and reshaped by mouth. Palettes were refilled many times. Supervisors inspected the work visually rather than testing for contamination. Women often brought their own cloths to wipe hands and faces. Some took paint home on their clothes. A careless sweep of a bench could send dust into the air. In one workshop, women stored extra brushes in their aprons. In another, they sharpened a brush between two fingers and a smile. The tasks were repetitive yet exacting. Fatigue built quietly across long weeks. After months and years, subtle health problems began to appear among dial painters. They experienced persistent fatigue, general aches, and dental problems that did not respond to normal treatment. Jaws became sore and teeth loosened without obvious cause. Simple fractures and bone weakness emerged. Doctors at first were puzzled, and some attributed symptoms to poor nutrition or routine dental disease. Over time, medical examinations found that the compound they handled was radioactively active. Scientists connected the health problems to long-term ingestion and inhalation of radium, deposited in bone. The condition that became known as radium jaw affected bone tissue and caused severe pain and decay. Symptoms were treated with care by colleagues but often misunderstood by supervisors. Descriptions of illness were harrowing without being graphic. Pain, repeated medical visits, and the slow loss of teeth marked a decline in daily life. Many workers faced repeated surgeries and long hospital stays, all while dealing with the social and economic cost of not being able to work. Families carried the burden. Communities watched as once vibrant young women grew frail. The narrative of marvel turned to one of quiet suffering.
When some women sought answers, they found resistance from employers.
Companies insisted that the paint and procedures were safe, and they offered dental or medical care that often fell short. Official tests were limited and contested. The workers themselves organized, shared findings, and sought legal help. One young dial painter became a key voice for others, traveling to tell her story and to recruit fellow employees to speak out. She gathered evidence of workplace practices, documented symptoms, and found medical experts who would examine the patients and assess cause.
The legal fight was as much about proof as it was about principle.
Employers argued that the women had used the paint improperly, or that their illnesses were unrelated. The women's lawyers countered with medical testimony about radium's behavior in the body and with photographic and physical evidence linking workplace practices to contamination. Simple but powerful demonstrations helped.
Physicians showed how the hands and jaws of former dial painters emitted detectable radioactivity.
Photographic plates exposed by contact with contaminated material provided a stark, scientific image of what had been an invisible risk.
Public attention followed. Newspapers ran stories that juxtaposed glowing watches with fading health.
Communities were shocked to learn how ordinary work had led to such suffering. That public pressure changed the tone of legal debates and forced companies to settle claims and to consider reform. The settlements and court decisions acknowledged that occupational exposure had caused harm. They did not erase the losses, but they did establish a precedent. Courts could hold employers accountable for dangers to workers even when those dangers were not obvious at the time.
Long-term, the dial painters' struggle reshaped workplace safety. Their case helped push occupational disease into public policy.
Regulations around radioactive materials tightened. Industrial hygiene practices developed more robustly. Fume hoods, gloves, protective clothing, and strict controls on surface contamination became standard in industries handling hazardous substances. Employers were required to measure exposures and to provide safer tools and training. The simple act of lip pointing was singled out as a hazardous habit to be banned and to be replaced by safer alternatives, such as mechanical tips and bench-mounted tools. Employers adopted monitoring programs to test for contamination and to protect workers before illnesses emerged. The impact also reached legal and cultural realms.
Labor law began to take workplace disease seriously. Courts and regulatory agencies recognized that modern industrial processes could create new forms of harm.
Medical research into how radionuclides behave in the body advanced, improving diagnostics and treatment.
Safety training became part of job preparation.
Trade unions and worker advocates used the dial painter's story as a cautionary example, pressing for transparency and for worker participation in safety decisions. Schools of public health incorporated these lessons into the training of future industrial hygienists and regulators. Today, the phrase Radium Girl evokes both courage and caution. It recalls how a routine job painting dials with a shining paste could become a hidden hazard through a confluence of social enthusiasm, workplace convenience, and inadequate protections. It also reminds us that ordinary people can change systems. A few persistent workers brought scientific facts, legal arguments, and public pressure together and, in doing so, helped to create modern standards that protect millions of workers. Thank you for listening to this account of the work itself, the careful strokes, the lip pointing that poised a tiny brush between teeth and tongue, and the crowded rooms where dust settled unseen. If this story moved you, please subscribe. Stories like this survive because we remember, learn, and guard the health of those who do the hands-on work that keeps our lives running.
The harm: workers fall ill and are dismissed, non-graphic.
Luminous paint that glowed in the dark made tiny numbers readable at night, and that glow came from radium, a substance once hailed as a miracle.
Hello.
Workers in small factories sat for hours under bright lamps, brushing a fine, white paint onto watch faces and instrument dials until the numbers seemed to shine. The bright promise of new technology hid a silent danger. At the height of the radium craze, the paint was prized for novelty and usefulness. People wanted watches, clocks, compasses, and military instruments that glowed without any external light. Companies hired large numbers of young women because they had the steady hands and patience the work required. The paint came in small, convenient bottles. Brushes were thin and delicate.
The task was simple to describe, but it demanded precise, repeated motions for hours each day.
Many of the women learned to shape their brush tips by placing the handle between their lips. They called this lip pointing or lip dipping. It was a quick way to form the bristles into a perfect point, and supervisors encouraged speed and accuracy in meeting quotas. Unprotected hands touched luminous paint all day, and tiny amounts of the material were taken into the body over time.
At first there were only small, hard-to-see changes, a loose tooth that would not grow a new root, strange tiredness that lingered after sleep.
But those subtle signs grew into deep, persistent illness for some of the workers.
Symptoms varied from person to person. Some women noticed that their teeth loosened and gums became painful.
Others felt sudden, unexplained fatigue and weakness that made the day's work impossible.
Bones broke more easily for some, and many experienced a steady decline in health that did not respond to ordinary medical care.
Doctors saw other signs too, anemia and weight loss among them, but the cause was not immediately obvious to most physicians. The condition that became widely known as radium jaw involved severe damage to the jawbone and nearby tissues, and it left its victims changed in ways that were hard to hide. When workers showed these symptoms, employers often reacted coldly.
Instead of offering medical help, companies tended to dismiss affected employees.
The rationale given to the women ranged from accusations of poor personal hygiene to claims that their conditions were the result of unrelated illnesses.
Some companies even suggested moral failings as the cause.
Those responses made it harder for the sick women to get attention for their suffering, and they magnified the isolation many felt. A job lost meant no income, and medical bills mounted. Simple needs, food, shelter, family care, became daily struggles. Individual stories bring the scale of harm into focus. One woman who once painted dozens of dials a day began to lose teeth and to struggle with pain that no simple remedy could cure. Another worker, praised for her fine work, found that she could no longer hold a brush, because the jaw pain and weakness made the motion impossible. When they asked supervisors for help or for changes to the workplace, they were often met with silence or denial. The common pattern was to blame the worker and not question industrial practices that exposed people to dangerous materials. As the number of sick workers grew, medical professionals and investigators started to draw connections between radium exposure and the illnesses. The evidence showed a repeated pattern: prolonged contact with radium paint, direct ingestion through lip pointing or contaminated fingers, and the onset of similar health problems among those who worked closely with the material. Even with this growing understanding, companies resisted acknowledging responsibility. They argued that radium was safe when used properly, and they pointed to other possible causes. The workers, however, had their own growing body of experience. Many felt certain that their daily work led to their decline. Facing dismissal and mounting physical hardship, some workers chose to fight. They found one another, shared medical reports, and sought legal help.
A few women gathered courage to consult lawyers and to take their cases into court. Public hearings and courtroom testimony began to tell a story that newspapers could not ignore.
Testimony from doctors, former co-workers, and the women themselves painted a picture of repeated exposure, denial from employers, and the human cost of industrial progress. The courtroom battles were hard and often humiliating for the plaintiffs, who had to face aggressive defenses and attempts to discredit their claims. Still, their persistence brought public attention and sympathy, and that attention would prove crucial. The legal fights did more than win sympathy, they changed the way society thought about workplace risk. Some courts acknowledged that employers had a duty to protect their workers from known hazards. Out of courtroom struggles came settlements and judgments that forced companies to pay for medical care and for losses. Yet the deeper change was institutional. Regulators and lawmakers began to see the need for clearer standards about hazardous materials, for better industrial hygiene, and for protections that would prevent similar harms in the future. The struggle of those dismissed workers made visible a gap in policy: how to hold companies accountable when new technologies created new dangers. From the harm of those early radium cases, several practical lessons emerged for worker safety. Companies learned that materials with unseen hazards must be handled with care and that protective procedures are not optional extras. Simple interventions, protective clothing, strict rules against handling brushes with the mouth, routine health monitoring, and better training became clear priorities. Labor advocates pushed for medical examinations tied to occupational histories, and courts and agencies began to recognize occupational disease as a distinct category deserving compensation. Workers' compensation systems, safety regulations, and industrial hygiene practices developed in part because of the courage shown by these injured employees. The legacy extends beyond regulations. The stories of those women shifted public perception about the cost of industrial innovation and about who bears responsibility when the promise of a new product harms people. Their fight helped build a culture of inquiry into workplace hazards and encouraged scientific study of radiation's effects on the body. Safety standards around radioactive materials in industry and medicine grew stronger. Training for workers, labeling and handling rules for hazardous substances, and monitoring for long-term health effects are now widely accepted norms in many countries. These measures have prevented countless similar injuries. The human cost should not be forgotten. The dismissed workers' lives were disrupted, many endured long recoveries, chronic pain, and social stigma. Families lost income and caregivers faced hard choices. At the same time, their actions laid the groundwork for protections that save lives today. The narrative moved from private suffering to public reform. It serves as a reminder that progress without precaution can produce harm, and that the voices of workers are essential in shaping safer workplaces. If this story resonates, please consider subscribing for more historical accounts that illuminate how people and policy shape each other. The quiet bravery of those who stood up after being dismissed changed the rules. Their legacy is clear in safer workplaces, better medicine, and the law that recognizes the right of workers to protection from invisible harms. The fight, lawsuits, denial, and public attention. Radium was hailed as a miracle, a glittering secret that made watch dials glow in the dark and promised a new era of modern convenience. Hello! Please subscribe for more stories like this. The craze for anything that shone brought young women into factories where tiny brushes and luminous paint were the tools of the trade. They learned to hold the brush between lip and finger to shape the fine points on watch hands and instrument faces. Managers called the motion lip dip paint. It was quick, precise, and taught as normal practice. The paint itself contained radium mixed with a phosphor so it would glow, and workers were told it was harmless. Many followed the instructions without question. Some became ill. Others died. One of those workers refused to let the story die quietly. She left her factory job and carried a small, stubborn hope that someone would say her suffering was not just fate. A handful of her co-workers joined her. Together they filed lawsuits against the largest radium manufacturers. The suits were awkward, painful public dramas. Plaintiffs described jaw pain, unexplained broken bones, anemia, and deep fatigue. Doctors who examined them used a new kind of evidence, the eerie glow of bones when exposed to certain tests, to link their conditions to radium in their bodies. The courtrooms filled with medical testimony, with lab reports, and with the strange new science of radioactivity applied to human harm. The companies fought back hard. Corporate lawyers dismissed the connection between the paint and the illness. They hired experts, called witnesses to question the women's work habits, and suggested other causes. At times they argued that the women must have ingested the radium by accident or through habits the companies said they discouraged. In depositions and hearings, the defense painted the factories as careful and the materials as safe. The legal strategy relied on delay and doubt. Cases ran into procedural snags, appeals, and friendly experts for the defense who gave juries reasons to hesitate. It took months, then years, for the first suits to move toward any resolution. Public attention grew as newspapers ran human stories alongside technical arguments. Photographs of workers, captions about their lost teeth and thinning lives, and interviews with exhausted mothers made readers uneasy. Editorials began to ask whether the public's appetite for glowing dials was worth a human cost. Women who once worked quietly in backrooms were now witnesses on public platforms. They spoke candidly and calmly, and that honesty shifted the tone. Sympathy mounted. Fundraisers and benefit concerts helped families who were drained of savings. Voices from labor organizers and sympathetic physicians amplified the complaints. Journalists started to chart how corporate claims of safety clashed with mounting evidence of harm. At the center of the legal fight were different kinds of proof.
Scientific methods that had been used in laboratories were adapted to courtrooms. Bone samples, medical records, and expert testimony from physicians familiar with industrial disease were presented. Even the glow itself, once a marvel in advertising, became a grim indicator in a dimly lit lab.
Yet proving cause in court required more than medical demonstrations. Plaintiffs had to show that the companies had known, or should have known, about the danger. Documents, internal memos, and testimony about factory instructions became crucial. Where such proof existed, corporate denials began to falter. The courtroom victories and the settlements were not just personal triumphs. They forced an industry to change behaviors it had once treated as routine. One immediate change was the end of casual painting techniques that required workers to touch the brush with their mouths. Factories introduced tools and procedures to avoid ingestion. Protective equipment and better ventilation became more common. Regulators and public health officials took note, and new rules were drafted to control how radioactive materials were handled and stored. The litigation pushed a broader recognition that employers had a legal and moral duty to protect workers from industrial hazards, and that occupational disease deserved the same attention as injuries from machines. Beyond regulations, the case shifted public perception about corporate responsibility. The legal fight showed how public scrutiny and media pressure could counteract corporate denial. It set an example for future workplace battles by proving that persistent, well-documented claims could overcome defenses built on delay and obfuscation. Labor activists used the outcomes as leverage in other industries where hazards were dismissed as unknown risks. Health professionals began to take occupational exposures more seriously, incorporating workplace histories into medical evaluations. And a cultural memory formed around the women who had turned their pain into testimony. The change was not instantaneous or complete. Many of the plaintiffs never fully recovered, and some remained in debt and need. The settlements and awards helped, but they could not undo the years of suffering. Still, the legal and public fight produced long-term results: better safety standards, stricter handling of radioactive substances, clearer reporting requirements, and a growth in the idea that workers should not carry the burden of industrial progress alone. Modern rules about occupational exposure, mandatory training, and protective equipment trace part of their lineage back to this fight. Today, the story stands as a lesson about how science, law, and public attention interact. It shows how a handful of determined workers, backed by doctors and journalists, can turn private tragedy into public reform. It also reminds us that new technologies often arrive faster than our understanding of their risks. Vigilance, transparency, and the willingness to question corporate assurances remain essential. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe. Legacy: New Standards for Worker Protection and Why It Matters. Radium was sold as a modern miracle, a softly glowing promise that touched lives and industries. Hello! The shimmer of radium paint brightened watch faces, instrument dials, and novelty items, and the worker who applied that paint often did so with care and steady hands, believing she held something modern and important. At the heart of the legacy is a startling clarity: the choices a society makes about workplace safety ripple across generations. The radium craze put a powerful, glowing material into ordinary factories and into the hands of ordinary women who were told to master a tiny, precise art. They learned to shape fine brushes by pointing them between their lips. They were encouraged to meet production quotas. Safety precautions were minimal or absent. The practice of bringing paint to the brush with the mouth, and the lack of protective measures like gloves, ventilation, or monitoring, turned routine tasks into invisible risk. Many workers later developed serious illnesses, persistent pain, weakened bones, dental problems, and other conditions that suggested internal exposure to a harmful agent. Those illnesses were handled with care in medical reports and testimony. The descriptions avoided sensationalism, because the story is about consequences, not spectacle. Workers' accounts and medical examinations slowly revealed a pattern. Scientific tools and careful observation showed that radioactive material could be incorporated into the human body and remain there, emitting energy for as long as it stayed. Radiographic techniques were used to detect accumulated material. Those tests, together with clinical findings, helped make a medical and legal case. The company that manufactured the luminous paint had argued that the risks were unknown and that the workers' illnesses were unrelated.
Company-employed physicians sometimes minimized concerns. Yet, as multiple worker testimonies and independent medical evidence accumulated, the idea that employers bore responsibility gained force. The women who had painted dials became plaintiffs in a broader struggle over accountability. They pursued compensation through the courts and pushed public officials to pay attention. Their fight was often uphill and deeply personal. Many faced skepticism. Some encountered legal doctrines that made it hard to claim compensation for illnesses that developed slowly and internally rather than from sudden accidents. They persevered with the help of sympathetic doctors, investigative journalists, and attorneys who were willing to test new legal ground. The legal contests produced more than individual settlements. They helped clarify that workers suffering from occupational disease could seek redress and that employers had a duty to protect employees from workplace hazards that could be foreseen or discovered. Courts and tribunals were forced to grapple with scientific testimony, corporate responsibility, and the limits of workplace disclosure. Those debates seeded new legal thinking, that employers must anticipate and control hazards, that workers have a right to know about risks they face on the job, and that compensation systems must reflect the realities of latent illnesses. Over time, these ideas matured into clearer principles within labor law, the notion that workplace exposures can cause long-term harm and that the legal system must provide a means to address such harms. The case narratives, the medical records, the cross-examinations all combined to shift public understanding and legal expectations. Practical safety standards grew out of those changing expectations. Industry best practices evolved to include protective equipment, engineering controls, and medical surveillance. Ventilation systems and wet work procedures replaced dusty or airborne processes. Personal protective equipment, gloves, masks, and protective clothing became central to everyday work in hazardous environments. More importantly, the radium story contributed to the development of systematic workplace monitoring, measuring airborne concentrations, performing biological monitoring when appropriate, and keeping exposure records. Regulatory approaches also began to incorporate the idea that employers should keep exposures as low as reasonably achievable, a principle that guides radiation protection to this day. This was not a single law or a single agency's act, it was a cultural shift toward industrial hygiene, toward measuring and managing risk rather than assuming no harm. A key institutional legacy is the emphasis on transparency and independent oversight. The radium episode showed what could happen when corporate secrecy, limited disclosure, or inadequate scientific assessment left workers uninformed and unprotected. In response, later regulatory frameworks emphasized labeling, hazard communication, and independent review of workplace risks. Safety data sheets and worker right-to-know laws, for example, ensure that workers and regulators receive information about chemicals and hazards used in a workplace. Routine inspections, permits for radioactive materials, and licensing for certain industries reflect a public expectation that hazardous materials be handled under clearly defined rules. These measures make it harder for a single employer's assessment to stand unchallenged. Medical and occupational health practice also changed. The need for early detection and ongoing medical monitoring after exposure became obvious. Worker health programs now include baseline exams, periodic evaluations, and long-term tracking when exposures carry delayed risks. Clinical protocols were refined to look for patterns that signal occupational causes rather than treating each case in isolation. Compensation systems adapted as well, acknowledging that occupational disease can be chronic and progressive. The social safety net shifted from reacting to obvious accidents toward managing long-term risks, providing compensation and care that reflect both the medical needs of affected workers and the moral responsibility of employers and society. The cultural effect is worth noting. The women who challenged powerful corporations inspired public debate about corporate ethics and accountability. Their courage influenced labor movements and public opinion, fostering broader acceptance that workers deserve dignity, information, and protection. That cultural shift made it politically feasible to create regulatory bodies and to invest in occupational health infrastructure. It also changed how scientists and employers interact. Ethical expectations around informed consent, independent review, and transparent reporting grew stronger. The radium narrative is often cited in discussions about research ethics and industry-funded science, serving as a reminder that good intentions or technical uncertainty do not excuse withholding information about potential hazards. Why does this matter now? Industries today handle far more kinds of hazards than early factories did.
Nanomaterials, industrial chemicals, biological agents, and new radiation sources present real benefits but also real risks. The principles born from the radium experience, employer responsibility, independent oversight, worker right to know, engineering controls, medical surveillance, and the Alara mindset apply across those contexts. They matter because they form our first line of defense against repeated tragedies. Worker safety systems are only as strong as the culture that sustains them. Training, transparent reporting, and robust monitoring prevent harm before it becomes personal and irreversible.
Concrete examples show the continuity.
Aviation and defense industries, which rely on luminous instruments and radiation sources, operate under licensing regimes, careful monitoring, and strict work practice standards.
Hospitals and laboratories use dosimeters, controlled access, and training programs to minimize exposures.
Chemical plants maintain material inventories and hazard communication protocols to ensure that workers and emergency responders know what they face. These modern safeguards are descendants of the legal and social awakening that came from workers who demanded justice and recognition. The tools are different now, but the moral questions remain: who watches the workplace, who enforces standards, and who ensures that economic pressures do not override human health?
There is still work to be done. New technologies can outpace regulation. Economic pressures and fragmented supply chains can obscure responsibility.
Vigilance requires not only laws and inspectors, but also engaged workers, independent science, and public awareness.
Education matters.
So does the willingness of professionals, doctors, industrial hygienists, lawyers, to stand with those who raise concerns.
The legacy of the radium workers reminds us that protecting workers is both a technical and moral task. It requires investment in prevention, transparency in information, and mechanisms to address harm when prevention fails.
Their story lives on in statutes, standards, and practices that most of us take for granted today. But it is not merely historical. It is a living framework for how societies balance innovation with care. The protections developed in the decades after those early factory tragedies underline a basic principle: progress should not be measured only by novelty or profit, but by the safety and dignity of the people who make it possible.
We remember because remembrance prompts action.
When a community, a regulator, or a company applies the lessons, through monitoring, through training, through an ethic of care, workers are less likely to become casualties of industry. Thank you for listening to this account of how a painful struggle reshaped the rules that protect workers. If this story resonated, please subscribe for more historical perspectives that illuminate how past fights continue to shape our present. They painted a bright future with a glowing brush and paid a terrible price.
Hello, and thank you for watching.
In short, the radium craze promised miracle paint that glowed in the dark. Young women were hired to hand paint watch dials, trained to shape their brushes with their mouths, and told the paint was safe. Over time they fell ill with bone damage, chronic pain, and premature deaths. When the companies denied responsibility, a small group of brave workers, the Radium Girls, took them to court. Their fight forced the public to see what had been hidden, won legal recognition that companies could be held accountable for workplace harm, and helped push the nation toward stronger safety standards for hazardous materials and worker protections.
This story is not only history. It's a reminder that progress often comes because ordinary people speak up.
Those women changed the rules. Their courage led to new medical recognition of occupational diseases, greater corporate responsibility, better labeling and handling of dangerous substances, and the legal pathways workers use today to seek justice. Their case helped build momentum for the safety laws and labor protections we often take for granted.
If you feel the weight of this story, you're not alone.
Think about the people in your life who work in risky jobs, and the protections they deserve. If you have questions or memories connected to workplace safety, share them in the comments below. Your voice matters. If you found this episode meaningful, please subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss future episodes. Next up, we'll explore other pivotal moments in labor history, stories of fires, factories, unions, and the science that reshaped how we protect workers. We'll meet the people who fought for change and the laws that came after. We remember the Radium Girls not as victims, but as catalysts for a safer world. Their glow changed the rules, and it still lights our path forward.
Thank you for watching.